So we have Muswood and Jackson with us at the moment, Crichton. So not sure how many are going to continue coming along. Just depends on feedback. Anyway, we're going to keep going. I was actually, Crichton is our guest speaker. Sorry, everyone. We just got into a bit of a deepish and meaningful with Muswood and his research. I'm just really impressed with your background, Crichton, because you seem to have been able to successfully blend a lot of the, the sort of technical, I guess, if I can be kind of like Silicon Valley kind of stuff with, sorry, how to put it, with some really, you say yourself that, for Indigenous ways of doing, knowing, doing and being have actually inspired you. So that's where I get, I guess, what I've said is a bit of a philanthropic almost feel with what you do, but you've done, work at the professorial level. So I am now going to, we have obviously, as you see, Muswood, Jackson and Fabal in our audience as three of our students. And they'll just pop, and I'm just going to actually ask you to tell us a little bit about yourself and your background in terms of your, like your transdisciplinary researchers and your career and what that actually means as a whole for you. Sorry, I did go off the script in terms of the questions. Thanks.
That's quite all right. Thank you very much for inviting me to join this conversation today. It's always nice to talk about things you're passionate about, preferably with people who are also somewhat interested in those things. So I hope that's the case today. And if at any point I start going off script too far, then just feel free to interrupt and rein me back in. Quite happy for you to do that. Transdisciplinarities, it's a funny thing. It sounds like a really complex thing, but to me, that's just how the world is. I mean, I find it quite remarkable how much we've siloed and segmented the world. It starts at such an incredibly young age. Like as soon as you enter primary school, really, I mean, sometimes even in kindergarten, we've got young kids in primary school at the moment, and it's, you can see it happening there already. I actually looked into this once and I found this term that I really loved and has really stuck with me since. And it was an expression that someone was writing about, the origins of the disciplinary world we live in. And they described as the golden age of reductionism. And what they were sort of getting at was sort of during the Enlightenment period, when there was such a growth in sort of the scientific and enlightened understanding of the world, there's always been this sort of balance between reductionism and holism. And the reductionist approach, for a number of reasons, became, I guess, more influential and eventually became dominant. And that happened to the detriment of a more holistic approach. So the world we live in today, at least in Western societies, is one that is really very much about that reductionist approach and that disciplinary approach to things. And we have people who have deep specialist expertise in particular areas, and there have been countless economic studies of the benefits of this. So there's a logic behind it and a reason behind it. And, I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but I think what we've lost sight of is the need to actually understand things in a more holistic way. So the work I've done with Indigenous communities has been very much along those lines. It's about, well, if you do understand the world naturally as a holistic system, then it's not just enough to look at the disciplinary expertise, but it's how does it all connect? How is everything related to each other? And how do you end up with a much richer, holistic picture of things? Because not everything can be reduced. There are countless emergent properties that happen through the interactions. And so this is something that's fascinated me for a very long time. I first, I guess, was exposed to this in my undergraduate degrees. So they were very technical. I did computer systems engineering and physics, and that's where I learned about complexity science. And my career was then very much in, doing computer systems engineering. I didn't know what I wanted. Like most people, I had no idea what I wanted to do when I left school. So I did stuff I was naturally good at, which is sort of the science and engineering, then did engineering. And because it was computer engineering, it was very easy to get a job in software, which paid very well, and I could travel the world, and I had a great time. But after a while, I kind of realized this really wasn't my calling. Wasn't passionate about this. I did it because it paid well and I got to travel. I mean, that's fine for a while, but eventually you want to do something a bit more meaningful with your life. So then I studied a master's degree in humanitarian development studies, which is about as far from computer science and computer systems engineering and physics as you can get on the disciplinary sector. It was like, social sciences right up the other end. And so I had these sort of technical background, and then I discovered that I was fascinated by this whole idea of all of the way I describe it, sort of almost a cliche, is making the world a better place. It's like, how can I help make the world a better place? That's really what drives me and motivates me. When I did this master's degree, I'd already read most of the books that were required reading for the course. It was just like, this is something I really cared about and was doing anyway. So it was nice to get a piece of paper to say, cool, you know this stuff. But it was driven very much by passion. So I was like, how do I leverage? I don't want to throw away my technical background. I mean, it'd be quite useful, and I thought there's a lot of value in it. But how do I bring those together? So that was sort of the start of my transdisciplinary journey. When I started my PhD, it was very much in that domain. So I did it at the Design Lab at Sydney University, and design's naturally one of those disciplines or sciences that lends itself to discussions across different disciplines. So that was quite helpful. But it was, the elements of engineering and IT and design in there, as well as the cultural side to it. I was working with Indigenous communities and trying to, it's anthropology. Because I was doing a lot of interpretive work, I ended up drawing on philosophy, something, if you're into that space, hermeneutic phenomenology, which as an engineer was difficult for me to say, let alone understand. But it was just necessary for what I was doing, which was trying to understand very different cultural phenomena. And there's natural interpretation that goes with that. So, I guess over the course of my studies, I've realized that this is a space I'm comfortable, because I feel like it reflects the world we live in. And to me, the world is transdisciplinary, and the problems you're trying to solve, like some problems are possible to be, understood and explored and solved through just single disciplinary knowledge. But real world problems rarely are. They really usually require multiple disciplines coming together. And my career's been, I'm not an academic. I haven't had a proper formal academic position at a university. I've worked at a university, but my role was to bring together industry and academia and community and so on, and to discuss and explore and run workshops to explore and understand and look at how you could address very complex challenges. So I've actually had that as a job. But I haven't been a proper, full-time paid academic. Most of my career has been in industry. When I did my PhD, I was working full-time. I think I've steered away from the academic side of things because I like to get my hands dirty. I like to do things. And so I think I make a very poor academic, unless I was, even my PhD was very action research. So to me, I've got to do things, and I'm not very patient either. So there are a few reasons why academia probably isn't a good place for me. Having a role at a university where I was bringing people together, that was actually quite fine. That was because we're working together with all these different diverse groups. And recently, that's something I've been spending a lot more time doing, is bringing these groups of people together to try and understand these problems. So for me, transdisciplinary is an incredibly useful tool, and I love the research side to it because, I may not be an academic, but I love research. I do research, and I love research, and people exploring these things and helping us understand how to do it better is something that I find fascinating. I've spent way too much time reading about transdisciplinarity and how it's done and how we can do it better. And we're sort of a long way to go. This isn't a solved problem. We're still figuring out how to do it better, but there are more and more principles that I think people are realizing, okay, this is really the basis of transdisciplinarity. This is what you need in order to try and do it. And the only other point I'd like to make at this point is that there's I don't know if you guys, have you seen the analogy using food for transdisciplinarity? Is that something you've encountered yet, or is that?
No, because I actually went through all those notes when I was putting this module together.
Right.
And so I actually adopted one or two, the food analogy.
The food metaphor and
I think the hardest one for a lot of students to get, with all due respect to my, wonderful students, but right across the board, is the fact that when you come together as now you can correct me too, because I could be wrong, because that's how I see the world, in a transdisciplinary model. And that's been one of the things that's actually, interestingly enough, it's up until more recent times, it's held you back from moving forward in academia, because the silos was the way to go to get a career back in. I mean, you know, I'm showing my age here, right? So I can tell you what it's like in those days. It's like, whoa, where did that idea come from? You know, but is the fact that you can actually come up with a whole new different methodology as a group coming from all these different disciplines to actually address a problem, rather than the siloed approach where you kind of, yeah, anyway. So
absolutely, the epistemological and the methodological aspects of transdisciplinarity is, I think, what really sets it apart. And I like the food metaphor, but I've heard a different one that I think is worth looking at as well. And it's just about transdisciplinarity. Like, the others are pretty much the same. The third with transdisciplinarity, it's more like you're baking a cake than you're making a smoothie.
Yeah.
And the reason it's more like baking a cake is because even with a smoothie, you can sort of pick out what's in there. You can tell what those components are. Whereas, you know, one view of transdisciplinarity is that when you're baking a cake, it undergoes a fundamental transformation. You mix all the ingredients together, and then there's some sort of external force applied, in this case heat, when you're baking the cake, and it changes things in a way that is non-linear, and you can't reverse engineer it to get back to the original ingredients in it. Like, it's fundamentally gone through a transformation. There's an emergence or it's taken a new form. And because of that, you just can't simply say what was in it. Like, if you get a cake, you can take a bite of it. It's like, oh, this was a chocolate cake. And you say it's a chocolate cake, but is it flourless? You know, did it have eggs? Yeah. Like, there's no way of really knowing what actually happened. There has been this transformation. And so for me, transdisciplinarity, it doesn't, I don't know if it always requires that transformation, but I believe there is a degree of transformation that happens. And that's what makes it really difficult to do. There aren't, in my experiences, there haven't been a huge number of examples of where that's happened. Quite often you'll get to the interdisciplinary phase where things are all chopped up, mixed together, and in interdisciplinary research, quite often you'll need to agree on an approach, a methodology, and an epistemology. There needs to be some sort of agreement on, this is what we're going to all adopt when we're moving forward. You may not necessarily need to create something new. Whereas with transdisciplinarity, there usually is that degree of novelty in how we're going to go about solving this, requires that novelty in the methodology as well. So it's a point that I don't think is necessarily closed. I don't think there's a general agreement that that's required or not. It's just more, in my experience, I've sort of seen with some transdisciplinarity, is that really that has happened, and it goes that step beyond just getting together and maybe agreeing on how we're going to do things. Versus, you know, when you go back to just like multidisciplinary, where everyone uses their own approach, methodology, and so on.
Okay, no, thanks for that. Thanks for that clarification, because you know, like the readings themselves often indicate one or the other or whatever. So I guess it's one of those things that we're still learning about transdisciplinary approaches.
Absolutely, yeah. And like I said, the jury's still out. Some people are happy with a smoothie, other people need a cake. It depends who you're talking to and which approach, but there's certainly no general agreement. Like, everyone in the world says, yeah, this is what transdisciplinary is and this is what it isn't. There's still some discussion and ambiguity about how it fits on that spectrum. And there is a bit of a spectrum there of going from single disciplinary all the way through to transdisciplinary.
Yeah, no, I like.
So don't feel bad if you find that a bit confusing at times. It's still an unresolved issue for everybody, really.
Well, thanks for. Look, you can't imagine how happy I am for that, because I think that I myself, I mean, but I was sort of like, I think for our students, it's really important, the points that you've made about that. Now, I'm just gonna quickly ask, are there any questions at this point from any of you? Lana, Julie? No, Julie's right. Okay. If there are any questions, you can actually put them in the chat as well, everyone. Okay, so we're looking at the communications in transdisciplinary research, and I guess what we say in this module is that once you've moved into kind of looking at transdisciplinary research, your communications and style of working with teams and leadership styles start to become more complex because of the complexity of what you're looking at. You're more likely to be working with international teams. You're more likely to be working, you know, with disciplines across the globe. I mean, I always think of a professor I knew who was actually headed up the Genepi Center, which is the genetics, and so he had teams across the world, you know. So how what's been your experience in terms of the skill set that you need? And I have noted you talk about connected leadership, so that you know, it intrigues me. You know, I kind of want to learn from you what are the things that you've experienced, and I'm sure our students would love to hear that too.
Yeah, look, and it's a great question. It really gets to the heart of all of this, because it's not possible to do this kind of research without looking at the communication, like explicitly, as to how that's going to happen and the principles behind that and how that can actually take place. It's funny because even when I started in my IT career, sort of the first decade or so of my career, I found myself, like, when people said, well, what's your role? And I was like, well, realistically, most of the time I'm a translator. You know, I started off as a software engineer and very technical, but then I moved into more the business analyst and architecture and more senior roles and managing and so on. And usually I was sort of the interface between the technical teams and, you know, whoever else we were talking to, the business team, the marketing team, and so on. So I found myself having to be that translator role. And that basically then just continued for the rest of my career. I've always found myself working between different cultures, really, and they could be organizational cultures, or they could be actual cultures, like working with First Australians and Western cultures, or working even like the different cultures you get working in the different sectors. So the public sector versus the private sector, and then startups versus enterprises. Because I'm also not particularly young. I've had a lot of diverse experiences. I've worked in a lot of different places, and so I've got a lot of different sort of understandings. I've lived and worked all over the world. It gives me an ability to then try and relate to the different groups and say, okay, I'm trying to understand where this group is coming from, the language they use, and how we can communicate it. So there's two things I really want to say here about communication in particular, and one of them is communication and leadership, and the other one's just more about the principles behind it. So I'll talk about the principles a bit first, and then get to the leadership side of it, because that's something separate I'd like to talk about. And when it comes to the principles of the sort of the communication, when you work with transdisciplinary teams, what you're going to find is that there will be people that you're working with that, you know, have a different culture and language, and you'll need to find a way of communicating, and that's not an easy thing to do. So for me, the communication is fundamental, because basically, if you're looking to collaborate and work together, the first thing, you need to build trust and understanding. And to build trust and understanding, there needs to be a baseline of respect for diverse ways of knowing and doing and being. So the first thing is it's very hard to do that unless you really have a solid understanding of your own worldview. And this can be something that isn't all that obvious to people who grow up in a very dominant culture. So for me, like, as a white person, you know, especially, you know, white male, I didn't have to think about my own culture at all, really, until I started working with Indigenous communities, and it was quite clear that I needed to understand that in order to then engage. So it starts with an understanding of yourself and the worldview that you bring. And you need to have then, by default, a respect for diverse ways of knowing and doing and being. And this can be everything from neural diversity to cultural diversity, like all aspects of diversity. Like, it's going to be different. There's a different way of understanding the world. And you need to spend a bit of time at that really core level of understanding the worldview of other people, so that you can actually then find ways to communicate.
Yeah.
So respect has to be the basis for doing that. And the way that's reflected is through inclusivity and accessibility. That could be something as simple as, there's no jargon. You can't use jargon. You've got to explain things like there's a explain like I'm 5 or talking to your grandmother. There's all these different tools or techniques or metaphors people use for how you explain things in an accessible way. And it's not to dumb down what you're saying, but it's actually to find a way of communicating the really essential points of what you're saying in a way that is accessible to people who are not going to have the same worldview and background that you have. So it's hard to do, but it does start with yourself. It's something that people are like, oh, I just need to understand the other. It's like, well, actually, no. You really need to start with yourself first of all, and then you can engage with people. And working with Indigenous communities, this great quote that I read that's attributed just to Arnie Watson, that she prefers it to be a more general one. That's if you've come to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you realize that our paths are bound together, then let us walk, and we will, we'll do this together. It's about that idea of togetherness. It's not that one is dominant or going to help the other, because if you're trying to help someone, that automatically assumes you're in a position of power. So unfortunately, power relations come into this quite heavily. And you've got to be very mindful of default, like especially with people who are educated in the Western world. There's a sort of a natural tendency to think of yourself as educated and others possibly as not. So being mindful of the power dynamics and basically respecting the worldview and the lived experience of other people who, will understand things radically differently. So that's kind of the baseline principles. And it sounds like, oh yeah, that sounds like some nice principles, and I'll give it my best. But when you actually really get into it and think about it, it's not an easy thing to do. It does take some time and effort to really live these and to make sure that you're actually practicing them. I realize now, when reflecting back on my first engagements with First Australians, I was incredibly rude and arrogant. I didn't realize it at the time. I thought I was trying to be respectful, but I look back now and I realize it was because I'd be talking and engaging with elders, and I'd be asking very direct questions. And that's actually a sign of rudeness and disrespect, but I didn't know it at the time. And now I sort of realize, wow, they were pretty patient with a rude young man, when I should have understood that, if I had spent more time really understanding and learning before I'd engaged, I'd realized that the conversation should be more circular, and we should build on the conversations together. And there wouldn't be this really sharp, direct questioning that I was used to doing as a Western researcher. So yeah, spend as much time as you can, like understanding the people you're working with and their backgrounds. And yeah, then it's really just a case of just practicing having those open communication. And the tricky thing is the assumptions we make about different people. Like we're constantly making assumptions. That's just how we are as humans. We can't stop doing that. What we've got to do is just recognize when it's happening, and that it's a question then of awareness, which goes back to the self, like awareness that stems from self-awareness. So being aware of yourself, and then being aware of, okay, when am I actually doing this? Have I made some assumptions here? And is there a way we can talk about this so that I actually get a better understanding than assuming that things are happening a certain way? So these are all sort of the principles behind the communication dimension that go into being able to do this transdisciplinary research. Because if you can't have those conversations and build that understanding based on respect, which then leads to trust, you're not going to have, like, transdisciplinary research will not happen without trust. Because you need to trust the other teams and the people in your teams, wherever they are in the world, whatever their background, to really explore the problem and then understand it in different ways, and then look at what is the best way of addressing it, which is always going, like the thing with transdisciplinary, the way you address the problems is always going to be bespoke, because every problem is unique and contextual, and every group of people working on it is unique and contextual. So the way you approach it and address it is only going to happen through those trusted relationships. If you don't have those trusted relationships, then if you try and jump in and solve it straight away before building that, you're just actually going to make things harder. So it's really going to be a process of building trusted relationships, so you can have those conversations and figure out together, actually, we should do it this way. And eventually over time, there'll be sort of an agreement, a consensus. Yes, this is how we should go about it. But it takes time to build trusted relationships, and it takes time to work this way. So one of the challenges with transdisciplinary research is that it doesn't fit with the normal research project definitions of like, right, you normally get grants. It's like, this is what we're going to do. This is how we're going to do it. This is what we're going to find. Tick the box, give me the money. A lot of the grant applications, they want to know what you're going to find. What are your outcomes going to be, and how are you going to get them? And you've got to dictate everything up front, and that's really difficult to do in this type of research, because you don't know what the methodology is going to be. You don't know what outcomes you're going to find. So for those reasons, plus the fact that it doesn't have, like, there's no research code for transdisciplinarity, or maybe they're I think I'm talking about, I'm not sure where that's at to now, but there certainly hasn't traditionally been, it's like, oh, you're doing transdisciplinary research, so we'll put you here. So that means you can actually book your research against it. We can track it and sort of say, cool, you're an expert at it, and so therefore you deserve to be treated like everybody else is an expert at it. It didn't fit into the disciplinary model of academia, which has made it difficult. But the reason it's important is because there is a trend towards impactful research. So that's research, and we don't mean impact as in H-index or academic impact as in how many people it's citations, that kind of thing. I mean actual real world impact.
Yeah,
there's a trend towards that. The government's pushing that in a number of ways. The ARC is considering this. It's happening overseas. Australia's probably a little bit behind. You can see it even more so pronounced, certainly in the US, but definitely in the UK as well. This is the direction research is going, is real world impact.
Go on. Sorry. No, go on.
Real world impact requires research that is more towards transdisciplinary. So quite often transdisciplinary research is built on disciplinary excellence. So you'll have researchers coming in and they're an expert in biology or ecology or mathematics or whatever area, but we're taking that disciplinary expertise and we're building on top of it. So it's sort of like another piece that sits on top. So we still need disciplinary expertise. And again, I'm not bagging that at all. It's fundamental. We need it. It's great. But we need to do more than that. We need to find out how we bring it together, how we actually combine it with different disciplines, and how it's taken into a real world context where we're taking also into account people's lived experience, the people that are actually experiencing this and how it impacts them, and understanding that so that actually helps form and shape the research projects. And that often doesn't happen. So yeah, there's a lot of challenges. I don't want anyone to believe that it's wonderful, but because things are moving in that impact, real world impact direction, there is a trend in that direction. We're going to see more and more funding in that direction. To me, the future of research is more this kind of research. So I'm just hoping that as it becomes more popular and there are more people looking at it, people trying to understand how to do it better, it's going to be easier for academics who are interested in this type of research to be recognized for what they're doing.
Yeah, well, I think the reality is, from my perspective, looking at the world without transdisciplinary research and people being more open about bringing in different disciplines and integrating them, like, baking that cake and, what makes, it can fall flat on its face. It can, I'm a baker and I'm a cook, and I know exactly what you're talking about. Even baking bread, people don't guess the ingredients because they have no idea. And it's the same
sourdough with yeast.
Yeah. It's like I brought a philosopher into an ARC program on integrity and they were organizational psychologists because they were putting together a new isometric thing. And because I was leading asked to lead it from the organization, I brought in a philosopher. They couldn't understand it, but of course, Michael was a specialist in integrity, etc. And one of the things the CEO wanted tested was honesty, in the psychometric testing. So to me, it kind of like, how can you not? But they did. Also, the philosopher came with lots of credentials, and it's like, this is going to take me on to the question that Jackson's got. He says, how can you convince an institution like a university that someone from another discipline should be brought into a project? So have you had experience with this, Crichton? Because mine worked out, but it doesn't always work out.
It doesn't always work out. To a degree, unfortunately, it does depend on whoever's making the decision on top and whether they're actually open to recognizing the expertise that other people bring and why it's relevant to this project. So in this situation, to me, it's always, the conversation should always be about the value that this particular person's bringing. And I'd almost not even make it about the discipline. just focus on the value they're bringing. And
Mm.
okay, maybe they're coming from another discipline, maybe they're not. It doesn't really, that shouldn't be the conversation. The conversation should be, we're trying to address this problem. We need these skills, and this is the value this person can bring to what we're trying to do. And if we don't have that, this is what we're going to miss out on. And this is the risks that it will bring. So quite often, and this, look, I'm stereotyping a little bit here, so forgive me for that, but quite often when people are naturally sort of reticent to accept other disciplinary expertise, they've got usually a bit of they're quite risk averse. I don't like taking, well, I don't understand those people. I don't really want them on my project. So if that's the case, if that's what motivates them, then frame it around risk and say, there's actually a really significant risk to the project's success if we don't have this person. So yeah, I would, if you're experiencing, pushback against that idea, then just don't make it about the discipline at all. Make it purely about the value that person's going to bring to the project, how it's going to be more successful.
Yeah.
And oh my God, if we don't do this, we are in big trouble. Because they'll be like, the risk radar will be just going, oh, okay, yeah, I probably need to look at this at least.
Yeah, I agree with you. I actually had the philosopher had a really long history of a lot of attaining funding for ARC projects, and the organizational psychologists really liked that. So, there was a tick in the box. So Jackson, it's about, and I know it sounds like a marketing thing, but this is where, this is where for me also, transdisciplinary, like we live in a world that thrives on transdisciplinary, just transdisciplinarity. We can't resolve anything by going down a silo, because that's just not how it's going to work. I mean, at all levels. And one of the reasons I stopped doing economics at uni, and I was doing well, but I stopped because they said, well, now you're all going to go out and become statisticians. And it's like, that's not how I see economics, and no, thank you. Now we have, the best center. We've had a speaker, it's like, and they do all these really innovative. I think, yes, exactly where we should be going, But hang on, I've got another comment. Jackson says, he says, I like that idea. The risk of the lost opportunity is bigger than the alternative.
Yeah.
Yeah, well done.
That can just be a framing. And again, that's a communication thing. It's again, understanding your audience and saying, right, who am I trying to convince here? And so communication and negotiation, I mean, these things are all interrelated, as I'm sure you've experienced. The other point I wanted to make before I just realized I forgot was about leadership and communication. So this is something that I've really become interested in over the past few years, because I kind of realized that, I've got this, cliche goal to try and make the world a better place. And it's like, well, what's the best way of doing that? And so I was doing a lot of strategy work. I was helping organizations, especially research organizations, understand what's the most effective strategy here. This is the problem we're trying to solve, and what's the strategy behind that? And I got to a point where I was like, well, I'm helping this organization craft this incredible strategy. It's got all this evidence and data behind it. We've done all this work, and it should make sense. But I kind of had this feeling. I was like, it doesn't seem, it's not going to actually matter, because the leadership behind this organization doesn't know how to actually execute this. Like, they don't really understand what they're doing. And so I've kind of realized the biggest barrier in a lot of these situations is around leadership. So I started, I've been interested in leadership for a while, but I found all the traditional stuff I was like, this is all wrong. And I had trouble putting my finger on it. And so the work I was doing with Indigenous communities, I thought, there's a lot here that I like, that I've understood, and maybe there's something we can do in this space. And then I was, just by chance, while I was working at the University of Queensland, I stumbled upon a group from the School of Social Psychology who have an approach to leadership that is very much about the group. And you think about it as like, when people sort of talk about leadership, it's like, well, how do you know if someone's a good leader? And you could ask them and get self-reported feedback, which is pretty much next to useless. But really, if you want to know if someone's a good leader, you need to ask their team. And that's because leadership is a group process. Like, it's intrinsically and fundamentally a group process. They've got a saying, it's like, there can be no leadership without followership. If people aren't willing to follow the leader, there is no leadership. So is the process of followership well understood? And so they've got this whole model. They've called it, they've developed a leadership program on it called 5R, because there's 5 modules and each one begins with R. Not the best name if you ask me, but that's, not my choice and decision. But it's an incredible program because they draw on something called social identity theory.
Mm.
This is something I'd never heard of before, but if you're into psychology, maybe you have heard of it. And it really, it's an incredibly powerful tool for explaining human behavior. You know, all humans are tribal creatures. We all identify with particular groups of people, and those affiliations to those groups and the social identities we form, like for example, our personal, a lot of people sort of get caught, oh, I've got my personal identity, and that's me. But your personal identity is actually based on amalgamation, juxtaposition of all your social identities. The social identities come first, and then you kind of figure out what your personal identity is. So we're actually naturally social creatures. You know, no man is an island. There's lots of sayings around this kind of thing. And so those social identities are a better predictor of human behavior than just about anything else. And it explains a lot of the phenomena you see today in the world, especially in political domains like, you know, the popularity of Donald Trump. You know, this is a man that even the feedback from Republicans on his leadership capabilities, they're always, you know, when they ask people objectively who would make the better leader, it's like, well, it's usually the Democrat candidate, whoever that is at the time. But that doesn't matter. I'm voting for Donald Trump because he may be an idiot, but he's my idiot. And he's my man. Like, and they identify strongly with this, and it'll override reason and logic and all those other things. It's this very, like, identity is really the core essence of what makes us tick. So exploring social identity theory in leadership is something that makes a lot of sense when you think about it. So when you take a social identity approach to it, leadership becomes a process of managing a shared social identity. And that includes co-creating with the team. So it's like, right, you know, we're all going through this program. And what's the name of the particular course? Is it communication and leadership, or?
This one is communication and collaboration. But I do happen to teach leadership.
Okay, cool.
So that's why I'm really interested in it, because I want to grow. Look, you said, you know, you're too old for something, and I look at you and I think, hello, Creighton, because I'm going to tell everyone I'm 69, and I just think I've really come to the point where I'm so old, I'm getting so old that it's like there's
you're young again.
Like, I'm just starting a new research project, and I'm looking at leadership, and I just think that, and I learn from all these wonderful young people who attend these programs. You're all my teachers, you know, that's how
we're all learning together. That's the nature of learning.
Well, that's right. It's like when you were talking about the Indigenous elders, they very patiently and demonstrated wisdom. That's where the philosophy comes in. You know, as you know, that learning. I'm just feel like a baby in some ways. Some of the things I'm learning in life, and it's a wonderful gift, actually, to get to a stage in life where you can actually look at the benefits. And with, you know, I'm listening to you, Crichton, talk about this transdisciplinarity and how our world is going, and the engagement youth have with the climate. And, you know, personally, I vision a world where knowledge is going to increase, where there are going to be some wonderful changes, is where we do all come together in terms of coming to some resolution about the world. But sorry.
And so if you want to understand the theory behind how we come together and what leadership looks like when you're coming together, then social identity theory is a wonderful tool for that. So I'm happy to send links to it. I encourage people to learn as much about it as possible. One of the leading professors at UQ, who's like globally recognized, he's an ARC laureate fellow, etc., etc. Alex Haslam is a wonderful, humble man, but very passionate about this. And I invited him to give a talk to the network of inter and transdisciplinary research organizations, which is an organization that's sort of been set up to really explore how transdisciplinarity can be, how to make it more effective for different research organizations. And it was really wonderful just to hear him talk about, you know, the type of leadership you need in this context. What does leadership in this context look like? And it really is about engaging everyone that you're working with to create that strong sense of shared social identity that we all believe in. It's like, you actually, when you identify with it, it becomes part of you. And so when you do this well, you really do have this idea of, hey, I'm a part of something that's much bigger than me, but, you know, there's so much I can get out of this because I'm learning from all these other wonderful people. And I realize we're all in this together. And so one of the heuristics for leadership that I read once that I think is quite useful, even though it's a simple heuristic, it's if you've got an organization and you've got a good leader, look what happens when the leader's not there.
Yeah.
Right? So if the leader's there and he's barking orders at people and everyone's being very busy and productive, great. As soon as that person leaves, what does the team do? Because if it's a poor leader, everyone just says, oh, thank God that guy's gone. Like, man, I'm so sick of him yelling at us. And everyone just like sort of relaxes and kicks back and talks poorly of this person. And you just sort of, that's not great leadership. A good leader, if a good leader leaves, everyone's like, oh my God, we've lost our, this person.
Yeah.
And we've got to find a way to come together and pull through. And how do we compensate for the fact that they're not here? And what can we do? Because it's about us as a team. And the way I've been talking about this recently, because this is such a powerful tool, is has anyone here had the wonderful experience of you worked on something professionally that other people thought was impossible, yet you managed to achieve it? Is that something anyone here's had? Has anyone had that experience?
I'm old enough to. What about the others?
Yeah, I'd love to hear from the students here. Is anyone,
Yeah.
It could have even been at school or at university, like it could have been a project you did, and everyone thought, oh, these guys will never get that done and they'll do that. Has anyone had that experience where it was like other people really thought, wow, that's not going to happen, and you managed to find a way to do that?
Lana, I'm going to ask each one because
no, sorry, nothing that kind of is coming straight to mind, but it's definitely something that I can see our team trying to kind of pursue in the future with a lot of like ideas and stuff that are coming forward.
I had one of those experiences at university. So I was doing engineering and we entered the World Solar Challenge. This was back in 1996. So it's sort of giving you a sense of how old I am. And yeah, we were a bunch of kids building a solar car to race from Darwin to Adelaide, which is 3,000 kilometers through some very rough terrain. And we didn't know what we were doing, but we gave it our best shot. We ended up beating every other university in the world, every other entry from Australia, including Ford Australia. So companies whose budgets were like orders of magnitude bigger than ours. Like we kicked ass in an incredible way. We got to the end and we're like, did we just do that? And I mean, I was just a team member. I wasn't leading that at all. I was just one of the team. But what had happened is we had formed an incredibly tight team of people. And we didn't even really we had a project manager, but he wasn't the leader. The leadership was distributed. Everyone took leadership role and responsibility for the bit they were responsible from. And we were in it together. And that's what happens typically, is what you'll find. And this is something that's quite well known in sports teams. There's a saying in sports, quite a popular one you may have heard, that a champion team will always beat a team of champions.
Mm.
And that's so true for anyone who knows anything about any sport. Like it doesn't matter whether you're talking about English Premier League, my sports, basketball. I'm nearly 2 meters tall, so that's definitely my game. You look at the most successful basketball teams, like Boston Celtics back with Bill Russell, for example. They were a champion team. There were other players that were better than them, but that didn't matter. These guys had each other's back. They were so tight, and they just overcame all the odds. So when you experience this teams that pull through, and it's happened a few times in my career, so I can look back at these examples. In every situation, there was no glorious leader. The leadership was dispersed. Everyone understood that we all had a role to play, and so it's, the way I talk about it is in this kind of, if you want to do this, and it's in my mind, it's necessary for transdisciplinary research to bring it back to the point of this conversation. The leadership is a model of leadership without, like, it's almost like leadership without leaders, or a leadership where everybody's a leader and a follower. Like there will be no visionary, charismatic, all dominant, glorious, wonderful leader. And the funny thing is that this program that they developed at the University of Queensland is entirely compatible with Indigenous ways of knowing and doing and being. When the English first invaded Australia and they encountered the First Nations Australians, the common expression is, take me to your chief, take me to your leader. And traditional Indigenous communities didn't have a leader. It was quite often there was a council of elders, but that's what it was. It was a council. People would The elders would sit down and they would discuss things and agree with consensus on the best way forward. Sometimes that consensus would take days, if not weeks, to come to. But there was no one person as the leader who would be like, right, we are doing this. This is how it goes. So it's funny because there's a lot of this, the research on this has been around for more than a decade in terms of high-performing teams, psychological safety. You're probably familiar with some of these expressions. The reason we don't have that is because our leadership model is broken. It's based on the premise of the wonderful, great, illustrious leader who will lead us to glory or whatever the hell they're going to lead us to. And that's not how it works. It's a broken paradigm.
Yeah.
So there's a different model of leadership. I've just become aware of it, and I've drunk the Kool-Aid or whatever you want to say. I believe this is the way forward. But now when I work with teams, and most of my work is based on real world challenges and we're trying to solve problems that require transdisciplinary teams, this is the leadership model that I pretty much insist we need to have in place. It's like, we need to understand that, even if I'm driving it, I'm not the leader, or I have a leadership role, but so does everybody. And this is what this looks like. So we're actually developing a both ways, like an Indigenous and a Western version that takes the Western stuff that developed at the University of Queensland, but adds a whole other number of layers to it that draws on the best of Western science as well. But to me, that's the kind of leadership you need when you're doing transdisciplinarity. It's about everyone needs to pull together, and say, cool, I'm the leader in my disciplinary background, but I respect the other disciplinary backgrounds, and I'll find a way to collaborate with them. And, there is no, necessarily one person mandating how it'll be done, because, why would that person know necessarily, instead of, having that discussion, that communication with everybody else to agree on the consensual way forward.
Yes.
Oh, sorry, I've been talking for a while there.
No. It's great, Nicholas. Crichton. I think that it really hits at some philosophy. There's a concept that non-duality. Anyway, in terms of the leadership, the whole thing. What you're talking about, Masood. Now, before you came in, Crichton, Masood was talking about how to gain support. Was that right, Masood? Do you want to, do you have a question for Crichton? Because Crichton has worked with tech and in startups. So there you go.
I have some question, but I'm not sure it's relevant to this topic or not. But still, I want to ask. Is it okay?
Yes, of course it is. Yes, absolutely.
What, in my experience, what I'm saying, because I was working at a university, and CSRO is a research organization. They also commercialize their research. Yeah. But what I am experiencing, like, I am working only quite few people, like only 4 to 5 people, and I doesn't have any opportunity to communicate to other people. Like, if a lot of people doing some same thing probably, but we didn't have any communication, any collaboration with them. So do you think it's not a kind of resistance to explore someone research in commercial world?
There are a lot of barriers and resistance to having really collaborative, open discussions in the research world, whether it's at academia or CSIRO or anywhere else. I know the first-hand experience with CSIRO as well, that they're particularly siloed and they don't like sharing or having open discussions with other people. And a lot of the reasons are just cultural, which are then also based on incentives and the leadership models that have been in place, because it's like people feel like they've got to protect their research and that's all they've got, and they're afraid of other people stealing their ideas. And when you've come from an organization where that's been the dominant culture, it's incredibly difficult to overcome that. Like, it really is. The only way you will overcome that is if you can find a way to build a trusted relationship with those people. It goes back to that principle. If they don't know you, they're not going to trust you. They'll assume that you're trying to steal their work. They're not going to share anything with you. So what you've got to do is, unfortunately, is find a way to actually get to know them. And that can be, you can sort of If there's a project that requires collaboration, that can be one way. It's like, well, you have no choice now. If we don't collaborate, we can't do the work. So that's sort of, you can put in place a structure or a process that mandates the need for collaboration. But even then, you're going to get resistance because they're still not going to necessarily trust you. Like I've been in workshops where this question's come up, and the guy was like, "Well, we'll just do a project where they have to collaborate." It's like, well, you can do that, and it'll help, but it won't be enough because the people will still be holding back. No one's going to openly trust or share. And yeah, unfortunately, it's very difficult to find ways to build that trust. If you've just got to, one thing that can help is if you find out who they work with and who they do trust. And especially if there's a senior person that is just like, okay, this person looks up to this other person, and you can get the trust and support of that other person, then you've got to try and build bridges and connections. And they're not necessarily just direct bridges and connections. It can be a network effect where you're just sort of reaching around and trying to find those connections and those ways in to eventually, through persistence and and by all the work on sort of demonstrating your vulnerability, so sort of explaining, being very authentic about who you are, like all these. If you look at how to build trusted relationships, if you Google that, there's a bunch of suggestions that come up, and it's a lot of stuff like you've got to be willing to demonstrate vulnerability yourself and be open with your own what you're willing to share to demonstrate, look, I'm a friend, I'm here to help, I'd like to collaborate. And you have to start by giving and saying, look, here's a token, here's a gift, here's something to build the relationship, start the foundation, start building a relationship. And yeah, trust is often earned. That's just unfortunately the way it is in today's society. There are different models for it, but in the situation you're describing, it will need to be earned because that person's been in a very distrustful place, and that's where they're coming from. It's really hard. There's no easy way of doing it, unfortunately.
But it's not impossible.
It's not impossible. And if you can persevere, the good thing is if you do persevere and you do gain their trust, then you'll have it pretty much forever, unless you do something terrible and stab them in the back. But once you've earned someone's trust like that, then they're like, I trust this person. And they're like, cool, you're part of my network. So a lot of it, again, if you take a social identity view of this, how do you position your social identity to align with theirs such that they see you as one of them? So you've got to find ways to identify with that person and find commonality. So that person's like, oh, okay, I'm more likely to trust you because you're one of us, whoever us is. So this person, he or she will have an identity. It'll be like, cool, well, I'm part of this group and I don't trust anyone else. So how do you gain their trust? How do you show your commonality to identify with them so such that they're open to the idea of, okay, maybe he's not directly one of us, but he could become one of us. And you can build on it that way as well. So again, a lot of this stuff is social psychology. It's not my natural home, but I find it fascinating and very useful for thinking about this stuff in all sorts of contexts.
I hope that helped, Masood. I mean, one of the things has it helped?
I'm asking the question because people, they do some research and they try to find something in next 2 or 3 years. Then eventually everybody lost their way and they go for other activities, not in line of their research. So I am experiencing this thing in Australia.
Oh, okay, all right.
Yeah, look, it's a tough game. I wouldn't actually recommend anyone become academic at the moment. It's really hard to get funding.
Yeah. But I suppose, like I said, it's not impossible. I mean, my life experience has demonstrated that. It's really interesting. One of the things I have found is like, how we say, if you can speak the language of another person, like Masood, Farsi hafizana, right? I know Farsi. Are you Persian? Yeah, no. Okay. That's the name gave it away because I had an ex-brother-in-law. But once you speak the language, and I guess that's it, and the language doesn't have to be, like Persian or Greek or something, I'm Italian, but the language can be the way they think. It's like Crichton was saying earlier, it's trying to get into their head as to what is important to them. Once you can speak their language, the doors start to open, and sometimes even immediately, because they kind of like identify, because we have this social identity, like we are creatures of, we like to feel we belong. That's where the connections can come in. But yeah, because I just totally agree with what Crichton's been saying. Lana, I think you've got your hand up.
So I did have kind of a question that was partially answered with that question as well, and some of your comments, Anna, is do you have any tips for kind of getting to start to learn some of these new languages? Because I know with some of them, I've dived in and it's really like opened up how I can engage with some of those people, because they're in a completely different discipline, and I like to even understand some of the approaches that they're saying to me. I would have to take that and write it down and go and dive into a bit of research and see how that applies and matches up. But I guess with some of the new ones, if you are trying to like look for that commonality and make those connections with, for example, like someone from CSIRO, what would be a good starting point? Would it be them or research, or is there kind of like a middle ground of learning these new disciplines?
Do you want to go first, Crichton?
I
know what I've done.
Yeah. So yeah, if I'm going to work with a group, then I will, before I engage, I will try to find out as much as I can, just using desktop research, just Googling stuff, and if we know who they are, do they have a profile either on the university or on LinkedIn or something, and just try to understand as much as you can about them and the discipline before you engage. In particular, like language is like that's how we express our identity. That's how it is communicated. So yeah, really understanding the language, try and understand as much of the jargon as you can, the terms, what they mean. So I personally do that first. That's just my approach, because I like to sort of have some understanding. And if you can find someone else, a friendly, to speak to before you engage these people that may be in the same discipline as well, like that, anything you can to sort of get as much of an understanding so you're prepared. And then when you do meet the person, it's like most people like talking about what they're doing and where they're coming from. And so if they meet someone and this person is obviously genuinely enthusiastic and trying to learn and understand, they'll take the time to help that person get up to speed. So yeah, it doesn't have to be that. I mean, like most white people, when you sort of first engage with Indigenous Australians, it's sort of like, oh, a bit scary. Like, what do I do? But we're all people, and they're happy to, usually happy to sit down and talk. And if they're not, maybe you got to find someone else. But it's, as long as you're respectful and they can see there's a genuine. I think what they could pick up with me when I was starting out, even though I was maybe a little bit rude, they could tell I was genuinely interested. I really did want to learn and understand more. And so I guess that's why they were so patient with me and persistent, when I was, they could have easily just sort of said, no, thanks. So yeah, having that genuine curiosity. And so, yeah, curiosity and humility, I think they're the two qualities that go an incredibly long way, not just in transdisciplinary research, but I think, just generally in life, like having that open mind and that humility to be open to learning new things. It's it can be quite contagious.
And I find some of the things that we don't teach you is who you know. You get to know actually we do teach you networking. Go to conferences that you would never normally go to. I mean, I have done this, and I've done this. When I say not normally, but go to a conference where there's a mild interest, you can see the connections, whatever, and you network with people. Use your existing people that you have. You don't know, maybe one of your friends is married an economist, or is going out with an economist. Pick his brain, like that's where the connections come in. But I agree with the Googling. I mean, if you think when I answer your discussion questions, this is to all my wonderful students, that I kind of like have no idea sometimes what your research is about. So I'm busily on the other side of the, you know, kind of Googling away, trying to understand the, oh, right. And because I'm reasonably intelligent, I can understand. So I put your pieces together and then I can say, oh, yeah, that would be a really good idea. So, you know, so yeah, Crichton is absolutely right. And, you know, Masood, you know, I really think that I can almost sense that one of the things that you might feel, I don't know if I'm right, some not difficulty, but, you know, tension with is the fact that maybe English isn't your first language, and so you're not sure how to communicate with some of these people. But, you know, as Crichton said, we're all human beings, and it really doesn't matter, you know. And I think if you can, you know, like take away the tips from here and kind of make those connections, never give up. If you're determined enough, you won't give up. And, you know, quite frankly, how I learned about leadership, and a lot of the concepts that I know, yes, the university gave me the training how to do research. Working in the world, the corporate world, whatever it was, gave me the training of how to, you know, you really want something, how to find it. You put those things together, and whatever information it is you want, you will gain. And whoever it is you want to meet, use your philosophy, your spiritual connections, you know, just say the person I'm going to meet is going to turn up, or, you know, somehow I'll meet someone who'll introduce me. Because how often does serendipity happen? A lot. Believe in it. You know, it's like sometimes you really have to go, and that's where our Indigenous people teach us so much, you know, because we've forgotten it, because we've become too, you know, our Western education has become too much into, you know, the tangibles, you know. I know I'm getting a bit esoteric, but, you know, that's how it really happens. And I mean, like, that's how it's still happening for me, and I feel very lucky, you know, even to be here with all of you. And Lana, your beautiful face, I mean, I feel, this is the Italian in me, I feel like going, oh, cutie pie, you know, that I'm old enough to be your grandma, not more. Which is wonderful. I'm sorry, I actually have come to a point to take joy in just who I am, because age really means absolutely nothing. To honestly, I started to write in one of the posts to one of the students this week was that I am actually, you know, I'm just amazed, humbled at like what is coming through from you younger ones in terms of your responses, your ideas. It's fabulous. I suppose we should finish on this note, because I think we've been over an hour. Ola, are you still there?
Yeah, I'm here.
You're amazing. I don't know what I do with that. Sorry?
I'm here at the back home.
You're wonderful. I honestly, I would not be able to do any of this without Ola. I have no, like, technological wise, and that's why we all need each other. And Crichton, you have been so generous with your time, and you know, I'm looking forward to coming over to Brisbane at the end of the year. We'll have to catch up.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's really wonderful. And some of you students, if I see you around campus, expect me to say hi, because I not always good at faces, but I at names, but I am really good at faces, Masood. Yeah. And Jackson, he's attended, you know, constantly these sessions as well. And it's such a joy to know that quietly in the background there is someone there who's taking this all in and participating in their own quiet way. It's wonderful. Well, thank you, everyone. We're all ready to say goodbye and go. Crichton, thank you again. You've been an absolute gem. Your intellectual, your knowledge, you know, your spirit, everything about you has just, yeah, wonderful to have you on board with the eGrad.
Very generous, thank you.
Thank you, Crichton.
If I can add very quickly, you still have, guys, if you're watching us online, still have one more week till next Friday to complete all outstanding quizzes and discussions. So take your time, but remember, Anna is here this week. If you have last questions, use your online discussions for that. And enjoy it at the end of week 5.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I'll be marking right to the very end. So, you know, or not marking, but reading your posts. So always around. Thank you so much, everyone. Thanks, Ola. Thank
Thanks,
you.
everyone.
All the
Thank
best.
you.
Bye.
Thank
All
you.
the very best. Bless you all.
Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.